You know that feeling when the wind picks up at dusk and something in your gut tightens just a little? There's a reason humans have always felt watched when the wind howls. Today, we're going to explore one of Scotland's most haunting beliefs, the Sluagh. And by understanding it, you'll see how your ancestors made sense of death, grief, and those moments when nature feels just a bit too alive. Let's start with the basics. The Sluagh, pronounced roughly as Sluagh, comes from the Scottish Gaelic phrase Sluagh na mab, which translates directly to host of the dead. Picture this: a dark flock of winged spirits, not quite birds, not quite ghosts, appearing in the twilight sky. They move together like starlings at dusk, swooping and circling but made of shadow and whispered sighs. Scottish families from the 17th through 19th centuries didn't just fear them, they prepared for them. So where does this story begin? Let's break the Sluagh legend into three clear parts: their arrival, their purpose, and the rituals people used to keep them away. First, the arrival. The Sluagh was said to approach from the west. This wasn't random. In Celtic belief systems, the west symbolized death and the afterlife. The sun sets in the west. The great Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly westward from Scotland's coast. West meant the end of things, the direction where light goes to die. Early travellers and folklorists visiting Scottish villages in the 1700s and 1800s recorded something striking. Villagers described hearing the whisper of wings before a death occurred. Not just any wings, a sound that mixed the flutter of feathers with something else, something that carried human-like sighs and a low whistling. Now, their purpose. The Sluagh weren't just ominous, they were hunters. According to the stories, these spirits swooped into homes through western windows if given the chance. Their goal was to carry away the soul before it could be claimed by anything else. Think about what that means. In the worldview of rural Scotland centuries ago, your soul at the moment of death became a prize in a cosmic race. Some accounts claimed they specifically targeted sinners or the unconfessed souls that hadn't been properly prepared for the afterlife. Finally, the protection rituals. Scottish families developed an entire system of defences. When someone lay dying, relatives would rush to close every window facing west. They covered mirrors and still water, believing reflections could act as doorways that drew the Sluagh closer. They kept dogs nearby because dogs were said to howl when the host approached. Church bells were rung during storms because the Sluagh avoided holy sounds. Bodies of the deceased were carefully positioned with heads facing east, toward the rising sun and resurrection. Here's where it gets interesting. Consider what happened when these beliefs intersected with real life. A sudden gust of wind during a funeral procession wasn't just weather, it became evidence. Strange lights flickering near a dying person's window weren't optical illusions. They were signs. The Sluagh belief created a framework where natural events gained supernatural meaning. Think about a specific example. An elderly woman in a Hebridean village in the 1760s lies dying. Her family has closed the western windows. The wind picks up. They hear what sounds like beaten wings against the shutters. Dogs in the village begin howling. The priest is called to ring the church bells. The woman passes peacefully just after dawn as the wind dies down. What really happened? Maybe a storm front moved through. Maybe local birds were disturbed. But in that moment, for that family, the story was clear. They had protected her soul from the host. These stories were strongest in specific regions: the Hebrides, the Isle of Skye, the Western Isles. These weren't random locations. These were isolated communities where the wind never truly stopped, where the sea dominated life, where twilight stretched long across vast empty skies. Geography shaped belief. Let's talk about what this belief actually accomplished. On the surface, it seems like pure fear. But dig deeper. The Sluagh gave shape to the shapeless. Death is abstract, frightening precisely because it's unknowable. But a flock of shadow birds, that's concrete. You can close a window against that. The Sluagh transformed the terror of mortality into something you could act against. It gave grieving families something to do in those helpless hours when a loved one was slipping away. There's something else here too. The Sluagh represented a communal vigilance. When the host was said to be riding, entire villages took action. Windows closed in multiple homes. Church bells rang. Neighbors checked on each other. The belief created social cohesion around death and dying. As we close this first part, remember that the Sluagh weren't just monsters in a scary story. They were a complete cultural response to mortality, combining fear with action, terror with ritual, isolation with community. Next, we'll explore the language itself and how words shape this shadowy belief. Words carry weight beyond their definitions. They hold history, shift meaning across centuries, and reveal how entire cultures thought about the world. The term Sluagh is no exception. By understanding how this word evolved, you'll gain insight into how language itself can build and transform a myth. The pronunciation comes first because it matters. Sluagh is pronounced roughly as Sluagh in some regions, or Sluagh in others, with that final sound being a guttural kech, like in Loch. The sound itself feels harsh, almost like wind through a narrow space. The phonetics match the phenomenon. Speaking the word mimicked the whistle of wind that announced the host's presence. Now let's trace the etymology. Sluagh derives from Old Irish slug, which meant army or host. This is crucial. Before Christianity arrived in Scotland and Ireland, Sluagh didn't carry evil connotations. It was a neutral term referring to any large group, especially armies of spirits or fairies moving together. The same applied to Sluagh. It described the phenomenon of many supernatural beings moving as one, but didn't automatically assign moral judgment. Then Christianity arrived. Missionaries encountered these existing beliefs about spirit armies and faced a choice: erase them or reinterpret them. They chose reinterpretation. The Sluagh became explicitly connected to damnation. Church teachings transformed the neutral host of spirits into the host of the damned, souls rejected by heaven and stuck in liminal space. This shift was strategic. The Sluagh were no longer nature spirits. They became specifically the restless dead, souls of the unshriven, people who died without confession or proper last rites. Let's break down the regional variations. In Scotland, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, the Sluagh solidified as the host of the restless dead. These were spirits caught between worlds, unable to move on because of unfinished business. In Ireland, a related concept existed, but with a different emphasis. Irish tradition spoke of fairy hosts that hunted wrongdoers, acting almost as supernatural enforcers of moral behaviour. Over on the Isle of Man, the hosts were understood more as mischievous fairies who attacked travellers, especially those out after dark. These variations reveal something fascinating about how oral cultures work. Without written standardization, stories shift based on local needs and concerns. Scottish coastal communities facing harsh weather and isolation emphasize the Sluagh's connection to death and loss. Irish agricultural communities with stronger social structures emphasize moral enforcement. Same root concept, different cultural expressions. The role of Gaelic oral storytelling cannot be overstated. These weren't bedtime stories. They were cultural transmission. Gaelic society preserved the Sluagh myth through specific verbal forms. Laments sung at funerals often reference the host, warning the deceased soul to fly east toward light rather than west toward the shadow flock. Keening songs, those high, wailing funeral dirges, sometimes imitated the sound attributed to the Sluagh itself. Here's where language reveals something deeper. The word host in English developed a double meaning relevant to our story. It means an army or large group, which maps directly to Sluagh. But it also came to mean a spiritual presence. In Gaelic thinking about the Sluagh, these meanings blurred. The host was simultaneously an army of individual souls and a single unified spiritual force. Consider how this linguistic framework affected actual behavior. If you grew up speaking Gaelic in an 18th century Hebridean village, the word Sluagh carried immediate, visceral weight. When someone said close the windows, the Sluagh, ride tonight, you didn't need further information. The word alone conveyed urgency. The language encoded the response. But here's an interesting twist. Even as literal belief declined, the language preserved cultural memory. Descendants who didn't believe in the Sluagh might still know the word, still recognize it as part of their heritage. Language became a museum, storing old beliefs even when no one lived them anymore. As we wrap up this linguistic exploration, remember that the Sluagh were made of words as much as wind. The way people spoke about them, the terms they used, the sounds they made when saying the name, all of this built the myth's power. Now we turn to how the Sluagh actually operated in these stories. Imagine standing outside your house at dusk in the Western Isles 300 years ago. The sky is that deep blue-grey that comes right after sunset. Then you see them, dark shapes moving in formation against the dimming sky. Your first thought might be birds, but something's wrong. They move like birds but don't quite have solid form. That's the Sluagh. The Sluagh were described as flying in flocks, much like starlings performing their evening murmurations. But while starlings are beautiful and natural, the Sluagh were said to be unnatural, wrong somehow. They weren't seeing obvious monsters. They were seeing something ambiguous, something that made their brains struggle to categorize it. That ambiguity amplified fear. Let's talk about their physical appearance. The Sluagh didn't have feathers and wings like actual birds. Instead, their wings were described as shadows shaped like feathers. Think about what a shadow shaped like a feather looks like. It's the outline, the suggestion of a feather without substance. The Sluagh mimicked life without being alive. Now their movement patterns. The Sluagh were said to move in swooping formations. Sometimes they circled dying houses before entering, often 3 times. This circling behavior wasn't random. It was reconnaissance. The host was checking defenses, looking for entry points, watching for that one forgotten window facing west. The Sluagh had specific targets. They weren't randomly grabbing any soul. According to the beliefs, they hunted souls of sinners or the unconfessed dead. people who died without receiving last rites. This targeting created a moral dimension to the terror. If you lived righteously and died with spiritual preparation, you had less to fear. What happened when the Sluagh successfully hunted? They were said to snatch souls as they left the body and carry them west over the sea. By carrying souls westward, the Sluagh were preventing proper afterlife transition. They were stealing souls from their intended destination. The specific destination mattered less than the theft itself. The Sluagh denied proper death. Let's discuss the sounds attributed to them. People described hearing a low whistling, mixed with fluttering, mixed with human-like sighs. The whistling would be like wind through a narrow gap. The fluttering would be rapid and irregular. The sighs would be slow and drawn out, disturbingly human. Together, these sounds created something that was neither natural wind, nor animal noise, nor human voice. Communities developed extensive protection strategies. Covering mirrors and still water was standard practice when someone was dying. Why? Because both create reflections, and reflections were believed to act as doorways for spirits. By covering these reflective surfaces, families closed potential points of entry. The Sluagh had weaknesses. They avoided holy ground. They couldn't easily enter when church bells were ringing. During storms believed to carry the host, priests would ring church bells continuously, creating a protective sound barrier over the village. Dogs played a fascinating role. They were said to howl when the Sluagh approached, sensing the unseen flock before humans could. Dogs do behave strangely before storms, likely due to sensitivity to barometric pressure changes. For communities watching for the Sluagh, dog behavior became an early warning system. Consider a detailed scenario. An elderly man lies dying in a stone cottage in Skye in 1780. His family closes the west-facing windows. The sun sets. Wind picks up. The family dog begins howling. They hear fluttering outside. Someone runs to the church. Minutes later, bells begin ringing. The old man takes his last breath as the first stars appear. The wind suddenly drops. The dog stops howling. What really happened? Objectively, an old man died during a storm. But for that family, the story was different. They successfully defended their father from the Sluagh. Both versions are true in different ways. As we close this section, understand that the Sluagh hunting behavior created an entire culture of practice around death. Every detail of how they hunted suggested a countermeasure. Next, we'll examine how the church interpreted these beliefs. The relationship between Christianity and older pagan beliefs in Scotland created a fascinating hybrid faith. Rather than simply condemning these beliefs as heresy, church authorities absorbed and reinterpreted them. Understanding this process shows you how religion adapts to local culture while maintaining doctrinal control. Medieval church writings took an interesting stance on the Sluagh. Official theological interpretation described them as fallen angels rejected by both heaven and hell. Angels who rebelled with Lucifer fell into hell. Angels who remained loyal stayed in heaven. But what about angels who wavered? Church scholars created a middle category, spirits trapped in the earthly realm. The Sluagh fit perfectly here. Priests offered another interpretation that resonated even more with common people. They preached that the Sluagh were souls of the unshriven, people who died without receiving the last rites. These souls couldn't enter heaven because they carried unconfessed sin. so they wandered, flying with the host until Judgment Day. This teaching had powerful practical effects. It made last rites absolutely critical. Parish records from the Highlands during the 17th and 18th centuries mention locals performing anti-Sluagh prayers. These weren't official church prayers, but folk adaptations blending Christian language with older protective formulas. Priests often tolerated these hybrid prayers because they kept people engaged with Christianity. Body positioning at death became a crucial church influence practice. The dead were placed with heads toward the east. East symbolized resurrection because the sun rises in the east. But east also meant away from the west, away from the direction of the Sluagh. So positioning bodies eastward was simultaneously Christian symbolism and protection against the host. Church bells became powerful protective instruments. The practice of ringing bells during storms served multiple functions. Bells blessed and consecrated carried sacred authority. Their sound sanctified the air itself. During significant storms, bells might ring for hours. The blending of Christian ritual with older pagan fare created what we might call hybrid faith. People believed in Christian heaven and hell, but also in the Sluagh. They trusted in Jesus and angels, but also closed windows against spirit flocks. The church officially might have preferred pure Christian practice, but on the ground level, priests recognized that faith worked in complicated ways. Consider how this hybrid faith functioned in daily life. A family preparing for a death might call the priest to administer last rites, all properly Christian, but they'd also simultaneously perform their traditional protections. To them, these weren't contradictory, they were complementary. The priest protected the soul through sacraments. The family protected the soul through physical defenses. The church's approach ultimately preserved the Sluagh belief, even while trying to control it. By providing Christian explanations for the host, priests kept the concept alive and relevant. People felt heard and validated while still being guided toward Christian orthodoxy. As we close this examination, recognize that religious belief is rarely pure or simple. It's layered, negotiated, hybrid. Now we'll explore how Scotland's actual geography and weather patterns reinforce this belief. Stand on the coast of the Outer Hebrides, and you'll understand immediately why people believed in the Sluagh. The wind doesn't stop. It's constant, sometimes howling, sometimes moaning, but always present. The sea stretches endlessly westward. This environment didn't just inspire the Sluagh myth, it demanded it. The Outer Hebrides are among the windiest inhabited regions in Europe. Gusts reaching 185 kilometers per hour have been recorded. That's not a once-a-decade storm. That's what happens multiple times each winter. Constant westerly gales inspired the idea that death came from the west. When wind is your most constant companion, always from the same direction, and that direction is where the sun dies each evening, you start making connections. The cries of seabirds added another layer. Storm petrels and shearwaters make calls that, especially during storms, sound eerily like human wailing. These birds fly at dusk and through the night, their silhouettes difficult to distinguish in poor light. Petrels were called storm witches or Mother Carey's chickens, believed to be spirits of drowned sailors. The birds and the Sluagh blurred together in the community imagination. Low cloud banks and fast-moving shadows at twilight created illusions of flying shapes. The Hebrides have dramatic, fast-changing weather. Clouds race overhead. Gaps in clouds create moving patches of light and shadow on the ground and sea. At dusk, when your eyes are adjusting and visibility is poor, these natural phenomena could easily be interpreted as flocks of something moving with purpose. During funerals, people often reported strange winds circling the procession. This wasn't imagination. Funeral processions created columns of warmth, people walking together, body heat rising. In windy conditions, this can create localized air currents, little eddies and swirls around the group. Combined with grief, heightened emotion, and cultural expectation, these wind patterns became evidence of Sluagh attendance. The Western Sea represented the other world in Celtic cosmology, the direction where souls departed. This wasn't arbitrary. The Atlantic stretches for thousands of kilometers westward. Stand on those islands and look west. You see nothing but water and sky merging at the horizon. It looks like the edge of the world. Souls going west were going into that endless void. Natural weather patterns directly reinforced the geography of the myth. The belief system grew organically from the environment. You couldn't separate the Sluagh from the wind because they were essentially the same thing, different words for the same experience of living in one of Earth's most wind-battered places. Think about living in those conditions year-round. Winter darkness lasts most of the day. The wind never stops. The sea crashes constantly. Isolation is profound. Villages separated by rough terrain and rougher water. In that context, believing the wind carried spirits wasn't superstition. It was the only way to make sense of an overwhelming environment. The Sluagh gave meaning to the meaningless howl. Now we'll examine the psychological and scientific explanations for why these beliefs took hold. Now let's look at this belief through a scientific lens. Not to dismiss it, but to understand why it made such perfect sense to the people who lived it. The Sluagh weren't random imagination. They emerged from real physical and psychological phenomena that science can now explain. Common deathbed phenomena provided fuel for belief. The death rattle, that distinctive sound dying people make, isn't supernatural, but it sounds unearthly. It's caused by fluids in the throat and airways creating bubbling or rattling noises with each breath. To someone unfamiliar with the medical explanation, it could sound like something entering or leaving the body. Flickering light near dying persons was another common report. Before electric lighting, rooms were lit by candles or oil lamps. A dying person's breathing, irregular and labored, could create subtle air movements that made flames flicker. Changes in room temperature as people gathered or as windows were opened and closed also affected flames. These natural phenomena could easily be interpreted as spiritual presence. Sleep paralysis explains many experiences attributed to the Sluagh. This condition occurs when your mind wakes, but your body remains in sleep paralysis, a normal state during REM sleep that prevents you from acting out dreams. During sleep paralysis, people often experience a feeling of pressure on their chest, difficulty breathing, and hallucinations, frequently of shadowy figures or presences in the room. The sensation of fluttering or wings is commonly reported. For someone in a culture that believed in the Sluagh, sleep paralysis would perfectly match expectations of what a Sluagh attack felt like. Auditory pareidolia explains hearing meaningful patterns in random noise. This is your brain's tendency to find familiar sounds in ambiguous input. Wind through trees, around buildings, across water, creates complex noise. Your brain searches for patterns and finds them, Someone listening for the Sluagh during a storm would hear whistles, sighs, flutters, because those patterns exist in wind noise if you listen for them. In isolated communities, about 60% of people report hearing voices of loved ones during grief, according to psychological studies. This isn't rare or pathological. It's a normal part of grieving. Your brain, accustomed to that person's voice, occasionally generates it, especially in ambiguous auditory situations. In a culture that believed the dead became part of the Sluagh, hearing your deceased mother's voice in the wind would confirm the belief rather than seem strange. The Sluagh myth acted as cultural therapy. Grief and death anxiety are universal human experiences. They're overwhelming because they're abstract and uncontrollable. The Sluagh made death concrete and gave people actions to take. Close windows, cover mirrors, ring bells, position the body correctly. These rituals didn't actually protect souls, but they protected the living from helplessness. They transformed passive grief into active defense. Birds became natural symbols of the soul's flight because birds inhabit a liminal space between earth and sky, between the solid world we know and the mysterious realm above. Many cultures associate birds with souls and the afterlife. It's intuitive. Birds fly. Souls supposedly leave bodies and go somewhere. The connection writes itself. The mind's attempt to explain environmental noise and death anxiety likely strengthened the myth through feedback loops. Someone hears strange sounds during a storm. They interpret it as the Sluagh. They perform protection rituals. The storm passes. The rituals worked. Next time, they'll perform them sooner and more carefully. Each cycle reinforces belief. Understanding these scientific explanations doesn't make the Sluagh less real in a cultural sense. The experiences were genuine. The grief was real. The comfort provided by the belief system was real. Science explains mechanism, not meaning. Next, we'll look at how the belief faded over time. Beliefs don't usually disappear overnight. They fade gradually as the conditions supporting them change. The Sluagh belief persisted for centuries, but industrialization and social change in the 1800s and 1900s weakened it. Understanding how beliefs vanish teaches us about how they form. Industrialization reduced isolation in rural Scotland. Better roads connected villages. Railways brought goods, people, and ideas from cities. Telegraph and later telephone lines broke information isolation. When communities aren't isolated, oral folklore networks weaken. Stories that once passed from grandparent to grandchild face competition from newspapers, books, and outside influences. The Free Church movement in the 19th century actively discouraged superstition. These Protestant reformers pushed for rational Christianity free from folk beliefs. Ministers preached against fairy faith, ghost stories, and practices like covering mirrors. They didn't always succeed immediately, but sustained pressure over generations had an effect. Young people caught between traditional beliefs and modern religion often sided with modernity. Urban migration to Glasgow and Edinburgh broke the storytelling chain. When young people left villages for factory work in cities, they entered entirely different cultural contexts. The Sluagh made no sense in Glasgow's industrial neighbourhoods. No western windows to close in tenement buildings. No storms approaching across empty seas. No dying at home with family gathered. The belief required its ecosystem, and cities didn't provide it. Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica published in 1900, recorded one of the last invocations. Shield us from the host of the air, keep the west wind still. Carmichael travelled the highlands and islands collecting prayers, charms and songs from elderly native speakers. He found a culture in transition. The oldest people still knew the old ways. Middle-aged people remembered but didn't quite believe. Young people thought it quaint. Carmichael was documenting a dying tradition. 20th century ethnographers found few active believers, but many cultural remnants. People might not believe the Sluagh would steal souls, but they still felt uncomfortable leaving west windows open at night. The specific belief faded, but the behavioral pattern persisted through habit. This is common with folk practices. The why gets forgotten, but the what continues. Some Hebridean elders still avoid whistling after sunset, saying it cools the host. This prohibition appears in many maritime cultures because whistling supposedly cools wind, and excess wind endangers boats. But in Scotland, it is specifically connected to the Sluagh. Even among people who don't literally believe anymore, the prohibition feels right. It's respectful. It's safe. Why risk it? Belief faded, but the cultural fear of death by wind remained embedded in Scottish superstition. Modern Scots might joke about closing windows during storms without connecting it to soul-stealing birds, but the instinct lingers. Culture has deep roots. Now we'll see how similar beliefs appeared worldwide. Here's something fascinating. The Sluagh aren't unique. Cultures worldwide developed remarkably similar beliefs about wind, souls, and death. These parallels suggest something deeper about human psychology and how we process mortality. Let's explore some striking examples. The wild hunt appears in Norse and Germanic lore. Spectral riders, sometimes led by Odin, ride through storms collecting souls. The hunt was especially active during winter solstice and times of transition. Like the Sluagh, it approached with sound, the baying of hounds and thunder of hooves. Like the Sluagh, it targeted the unprepared and unprotected. The main difference is transportation. The Germanic tradition used horses while the Scottish tradition used bird forms. The Slavic Drekavac was the ghost of an unbaptized child, heard wailing at night, especially near crossroads and cemeteries. It didn't hunt souls like the Sluagh, but shared the association of tragic death, creating restless spirits that manifest as sound in darkness. The cry of the Drekavac supposedly predicted death, similar to how hearing the Sluagh's wings meant someone would die soon. Japan's Tengu were crow or bird-like spirits that punished arrogance and misbehavior. They lived in mountains and forests, appearing as either birdmen or as birds. Tengu could steal people or possess them. While not specifically death omens, they shared the Sluagh's bird form and moral enforcement aspects. Both represented supernatural justice. The Aztec Chihuateteo were spirits of women who died in childbirth, considered warriors who fought and died in battle. They flew westward at dusk, haunting crossroads and bringing illness to children. The western direction and twilight timing directly parallel the Sluagh. Both cultures independently associated west with death and souls with flight. Many Native American tribes told of wind spirits that carried voices of the dead in storms. The specifics varied by region, but the core idea remained consistent. Wind wasn't just air moving, it was spiritually active, carrying messages or threats from the afterlife. Some traditions said hearing your name called in the wind meant death would visit soon. Common themes across all these cultures included souls connected to wind or flight, death approaching from the west or in storms, and group movement like flocks or hunts. These patterns aren't coincidental. They suggest universal human instincts about death and nature. Why would separate cultures develop such similar beliefs? Several factors explain it. Wind is invisible but powerful, making it naturally mysterious. It makes sounds ranging from whispers to roars. It moves things. It affects the weather. It comes and goes unpredictably. These qualities make wind feel alive, intentional. Associating it with spirits is intuitive. Flight represents transcendence and transition. Birds move between earth and sky. Souls supposedly move between life and afterlife. The metaphor is obvious and compelling. Western direction connects to sunset in the northern hemisphere, where most of these cultures developed. Sunset is a daily death of light. It's natural to associate it with mortality. These shared patterns suggest that the Sluagh aren't just Scottish folklore. They're a specifically Scottish expression of universal human attempts to understand death through natural phenomena. Next, we'll look at how the Sluagh is remembered in modern times. The Sluagh might have faded as living belief, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they transformed into cultural memory, tourist attraction, artistic inspiration, and symbolism. Understanding this transformation shows how folklore adapts to survive. In modern Scotland, folklore revivals have brought the Sluagh back into public memory. Scottish cultural organisations promote Gaelic language and traditions. Museums display information about old beliefs. Schools teach local folklore. The Sluagh appear in these contexts not as genuine threats, but as heritage, connection to ancestral ways of understanding the world. Ghost tours in Edinburgh and Skye often include Sluagh stories. Tour guides lead groups through atmospheric locations, sharing tales of the host of the dead. These tours blend entertainment with education. Tourists get a spooky experience and learn about Scottish culture. The Sluagh serve commercial and educational purposes simultaneously. Writers and artists use the host in horror and fantasy works. Modern video games set in Celtic-inspired worlds feature Sluagh-like creatures. Novels about Scottish history or folklore include them. Artists paint dramatic images of shadow birds circling ancient cottages. The Sluagh have become intellectual property, characters in stories, aesthetic inspiration. They've moved from believed-in spirits to narrative devices. Paranormal investigators report cold air pockets in west-facing rooms, echoing the old superstition. Whether these investigations find anything genuine is debatable, but they keep Sluagh consciousness alive. People visit supposedly haunted locations specifically looking for Sluagh evidence. The belief transforms into participatory entertainment. Online Scottish communities still share accounts of black shadow sightings during storms, called the host riding. Internet forums and social media allow people to share experiences and interpretations. Some participants genuinely believe. Others engage playfully. The distinction blurs in digital spaces where sincerity and performance mix freely. Academic folklorists study the Sluagh as examples of how oral cultures manage death anxiety. Universities offer courses analysing Celtic folklore. Researchers publish papers examining the Sluagh's psychological, social, and environmental functions. The belief becomes data, analysed for what it reveals about human behaviour and cultural evolution. Neo-pagan groups reinterpret the Sluagh as guardians of the dead, rather than predators. Modern paganism often reclaims and reimagines old beliefs, stripping away Christian reinterpretation to reach supposedly older, more authentic meanings. In this view, the Sluagh weren't evil. They were psychopomps, guides helping souls transition. This reinvention creates new meanings for old symbols. The myth has shifted from terror to poetry, from curse to symbol of memory and loss. Modern Scots who know about the Sluagh might use them metaphorically, saying the host rides tonight when storms come, not meaning it literally, but using the phrase to acknowledge weather and mood. Language becomes gesture, maintaining connection without requiring belief. This transformation is what keeps folklore alive. It stops being literal truth, but continues as cultural reference, artistic inspiration, identity marker. The Sluagh survives by being useful in new ways. Finally, we'll explore what the Sluagh really represented at their core. We've explored the Sluagh from many angles: their mythology, language, behavior, religious context, environmental origins, psychological basis, historical decline, worldwide parallels, and modern revival. Now let's step back and ask the fundamental question. What were the Sluagh really about? What did they mean beneath all the specific details? The Sluagh represents the fear of the unremembered dead, the souls without prayer or kin. In Gaelic culture, being forgotten was a fate worse than death. Your name spoken kept you alive in memory. Stories about you preserved your essence. But dying alone, unmourned, unspoken of, that was true death. The Sluagh were those forgotten ones, condemned to fly eternally because nobody anchored them to earth through memory. This explains why they hunted fresh souls, to recruit more forgotten ones to their ranks. They symbolize the lonely death, blown away by the winds of time. The Sluagh always approached dying persons, trying to snatch souls before family and community could claim them. This represented the terror of dying isolated and unprotected. In cultures where communal bonds were essential survival mechanisms, isolation meant vulnerability. The Sluagh made that vulnerability supernatural. Their westward flight mirrors Scotland's own history of emigration and loss. For centuries, Scots have left their homeland, sailing west to America, Australia, elsewhere. They left and often never returned. Families lost contact, names faded. The Sluagh flying west with stolen souls perfectly captures this cultural wound. Every emigrant was potentially a soul lost to the westward wind, never to be remembered. The myth preserved respect for death, wind, and the unseen, all forces beyond human control. By making wind spiritual rather than just mechanical, the Sluagh belief kept people humble before nature. You couldn't control wind, but you could respect it, prepare for it, and acknowledge its power. The belief maintained appropriate reverence for forces larger than human will. Psychologically, the Sluagh made guilt, fear, and isolation visible. Abstract emotions are hard to process. Concrete images are easier. The Sluagh transformed internal psychological states into external threats you could see and hear. This externalization allowed people to address emotions indirectly through ritual and action, rather than wrestling with them internally, where they remained overwhelming. Even without belief, the story endures because it gives shape to absence. We still feel the wind. We still fear forgotten death. We still watch our loved ones die and feel helpless. The Sluagh provided a vocabulary for these experiences. Modern people might not believe in shadow birds, but we recognize what they represented: the terror of mortality, the pain of loss, the fear of being forgotten. The host on the wind remains a poetic echo of mortality itself. When you hear wind howl at dusk, especially near water, especially in Scotland, you're hearing what generations before you heard. They called it the Sluagh. You might call it weather. But the sound is the same. The feeling it creates is the same. The reminder of death's presence is the same. Understanding the Sluagh teaches us that folklore isn't primitive misunderstanding. It's sophisticated psychological and social technology. The Sluagh belief served real functions: managing death anxiety, creating communal bonds, providing ritual structure during crisis, offering explanations for natural phenomena, maintaining respect for nature, preserving moral teachings. It did all this without requiring literal truth. The belief worked because it addressed real human needs. Today we have different tools for these purposes. Psychology helps us process grief. Medicine explains death's physical process. Science interprets natural phenomena. But we've arguably lost something too. The rich symbolic language, the communal ritual, the acceptance of mystery. The Sluagh offered meaning alongside explanation. They provided poetry alongside function. As we close, remember that the Sluagh aren't just old superstitions from a backward time. They're evidence of human creativity in the face of death's mystery. Our ancestors weren't foolish or ignorant. They were doing exactly what humans do best: creating meaningful narratives that help us survive emotionally and socially in a world that often feels overwhelming and incomprehensible. The Sluagh gave people a way to talk about the unspeakable. Death is hard to discuss directly. It's frightening. It's final. It raises questions nobody can answer. But talking about shadow birds, that's manageable. You can describe their behavior, debate the best protections, share stories about encounters. The Sluagh created a safe distance from which to approach death without confronting it head-on. This wasn't avoidance, it was wisdom. Think about what's been lost in our modern approach to death. We've gained medical understanding and comfort, which is invaluable. But we've also isolated death in hospitals and nursing homes. We speak of it in clinical terms or avoid mentioning it altogether. We lack communal rituals that bring people together. We often face grief alone rather than as villages and extended families once did. The Sluagh, for all their terror, kept death present and visible in daily life. They made it something communities addressed together. There's something profound in how the Sluagh treated memory as protection. Your family remembering you, speaking your name, praying for you. These weren't just nice gestures. They were shields against oblivion. In that world view, love and memory had actual power. They could fight supernatural forces. Modern culture says memory is private and internal, important only sentimentally. The Sluagh tradition said memory was active, protective, essential. Which perspective honors the dead more deeply? The environmental awareness embedded in the belief deserves recognition too. The Sluagh taught that nature wasn't background scenery. Wind, water, twilight, weather patterns, all of these were active participants in human life and death. You paid attention to western winds, not from superstition, but from lived understanding that the environment shapes experience. Today, we talk about being connected to nature as though it's optional. The Sluagh worldview made that connection mandatory and immediate. Consider the moral framework. The Sluagh primarily hunted the unconfessed, the unprepared, those who died in spiritual disarray. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was a system that encouraged people to live in a state of grace, to reconcile conflicts, to maintain relationships, to stay spiritually attentive. You couldn't procrastinate your spiritual life because death might arrive on the western wind tonight. This urgency, while potentially anxiety-producing, also pushed people toward better behavior. How many feuds were resolved? How many confessions made? How many relationships repaired because people genuinely believed their soul safety depended on it? The Sluagh also democratized the supernatural. They weren't distant myths about gods and heroes. They were immediate, local, relevant to every person's life. Everyone faced death. Everyone therefore needed to understand and prepare for the Sluagh. This wasn't specialized knowledge for priests or scholars. It was practical information for survival. That accessibility made the belief powerful and persistent. Let's acknowledge too what the Sluagh says about human resilience. People living in harsh conditions, the windiest inhabited places in Europe, with limited resources and profound isolation, created a belief system that didn't just express fear. It also provided hope and agency. Yes, the Sluagh were terrifying, but you could defend against them. You weren't helpless. Close the windows, ring the bells, position the body correctly, cover the mirrors. The belief gave practical steps that transformed terror into action. That's not primitive thinking. That's sophisticated psychological coping. The story's survival into modern times, even as literal belief faded, shows its deep resonance. We keep returning to the Sluagh in art, literature, tourism, academic study, because they capture something true about the human condition. They remind us that we've always struggled with mortality, always created stories to help us cope, always sought meaning in the face of the meaningless. The specific form changes across cultures and centuries, but the need remains constant. What the Sluagh really are ultimately is us. They're our fear given wings, our love given power through memory. Our communities are given purpose through shared ritual. Our environments given voice through story. They're proof that humans are meaning-making creatures who will always find ways to understand and endure what seems unendurable. When you hear wind whistling through trees at dusk, or watch storm clouds racing across the sky, or stand at someone's deathbed feeling utterly helpless, you're experiencing what humans have always experienced. The Sluagh was one culture's answer to those universal moments. Your answer might be different. The vocabulary might be scientific rather than supernatural, psychological rather than spiritual. But you're still doing what those Scottish villagers did, trying to make sense of forces beyond your control, seeking comfort in the face of loss, attempting to protect what you love from what you fear. The host of the dead still circles above the western sea in stories, in memory, in the howl of wind that makes you pause and listen. Not because they're real in any literal sense, but because they're real in the way that all meaningful stories are real. They tell us something true about ourselves. They connect us to ancestors who face the same darkness we face. They remind us that humans have always been creative, resilient, and determined to find meaning even in, especially in, death's shadow. The Sluagh endure because we endure. And as long as we tell their story, as long as we remember the host of the dead, we're doing exactly what that story always taught. That memory is power, that speaking names preserve souls, that telling stories keeps the wind from carrying everything away into forgetfulness. That's what the Sluagh really is. A wind that never quite stops blowing. A story that never quite finishes. A reminder, forever circling above the western sea, that death is universal, but so is the human need to face it with courage, creativity, and community.